Good idea to get started here. Thank you all so much for being here and being at the event tonight. This is going to be an informational workshop, just introducing folks to what exactly is the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit People crisis. Before we get started, I wanted to introduce myself and to introduce my co-presenter, Danjo Shichoni, Shi'i Michaela Allen, Shiji, San Benito, Texas, Shi'i Nasha, Shi'i Sapayende. My name is Michaela Allen. My pronouns are she, they. I'm from the Lipan Apache tribe of Texas, and I also of Shoshone descent. My family is originally from San Benito, Texas. I was born and raised in San Diego, California. I'm a senior here at UCSB, double majoring in communication and sociology, and I'm one of our peer mentors for the American Indian and Indigenous Cultural Resource Center. I'm going to toss it over to Lupe now to introduce themselves.
Hi everyone, I'm Lupe. I'm a fourth year Chicano Studies major with an Indigenous Studies minor. I also go by she, they pronouns, and I'm happy that you all were able to join us today.
Hey y'all, my name is Luther Richmond. I'm an EOP counselor and coordinator of the American Indian and Indigenous Cultural Resource Center, aka the AIICRC. I'll be hanging out today, not presenting. I'll be doing the tech support, but I'm here. We're all here to connect with y'all for any academic support, emotional support. We can talk about finances. And even though we're virtual, we are still here for counseling and events like these. So please don't hesitate to reach out. And I hope to meet some of the new faces in here soon. Thank you.
I think we can get started with the first slides now.
Okay, so I would like to, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this place and all land upon which the University of Santa Barbara is located, and pay our respects to the Chumash elders, past, present, and future, for they hold the memories, the traditions, and the culture of this area, which has become a place of learning for people from all over the world. I would also like to personally thank the creators for another day of life and for the plants and the animals that have nourished my body, and recognize that my survival is dependent on their well-being, and therefore we all hold the responsibility to respect the land and its traditional custodians. Go on to the next slide. This presentation will be discussing sensitive concepts that can cause distress to some people. There will be language used to describe violence towards others, such as sexual assault, murder, and genocide. Please take the time to take care for yourself, for both during and after, and listening to this presentation. And also, this may be close to home for some people, so please take the time that you need to take care of yourself if this is triggering to you. Some of the presentation agreements that we would like to share is that, one, you will not know everything there is to know about the missing, murdered Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit crisis after this short presentation. No one is an expert in general. Our education and efforts are ongoing. Also, what is said here stays here. So if anybody shares stuff that is based on their personal experience, we would please ask you all to just keep it within here. Also, your questions are welcome, but please be mindful and respectful that presenters are not obligated to share personal stories and can refuse to answer your questions. We wanted to introduce the agenda to you all. So we will be first define the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit crisis. Michaela will also be providing historical context and statistics to some of the different intersectional concepts that affect this crisis and have made it what it is today. So that would include Native peoples and the law, hypersexualization of Native women, and the connection between pipelines and the MMIWG2S crisis. And then at the end, we will also be talking about some of the ways that you can all be an ally to this movement, and there will be a time for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Lupe. Yeah, and throughout this presentation, feel free, if you have any questions at all, you can put them in the chat and there will be time at the end to answer the questions, hopefully. So just, stick with us to the end if you can. And everyone who's here, also, if you stay to the end, we are giving away $25 gift cards. So if at the end, we'll take down everyone's names and you get the chance to win a $25 gift card to 8th Generation, which is a really amazing Native-owned company. They make awesome, wool blankets and jewelry and things of that nature. So just, an added incentive. Before we get started, though, I do kind of want to introduce some terminology that we're going to be using just to help frame our discussion. We've thrown out this acronym a couple times now, MMIW, MMIWG2S. And if you're wondering what those things mean, or if you've never been introduced to this crisis before, you are definitely not alone. Unfortunately, it is a crisis that is often, rendered invisible and is not talked about in mainstream media. The reason that we chose to talk about it this week is yesterday was May 5th, and May 5th is the National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. The White House actually issued a national proclamation yesterday recognizing May 5th as the National Day of Awareness. So that was, regardless of your feelings about the government, it was nice to get recognition from such an office that's really high up, like the highest office, I guess. And it's just something that we want to raise awareness to because it has impacted many of our lives as Indigenous peoples. So this crisis is an epidemic essentially that's occurring across the Americas, in which these populations, so Native and Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit peoples, are facing disproportionately high rates of violence, assault, murder, and kidnapping. So the acronym MMIW obviously stands for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. Sometimes you'll see it lengthened to MMIWG2S, which encompasses girls and Two-Spirit peoples. And then MMIR stands for, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives. You'll sometimes see that being used instead. I alternate between these different acronyms. I like to focus on the first two, however, because I think they shine a light on the populations that are disproportionately targeted as a result of gender or sexual orientation, which are our women, girls, and our Two-Spirit peoples. But this is something that occurs across Turtle Islands or across the Americas to all of our Indigenous relatives. It also, this crisis talks about a lack of institutional documentation by police and law enforcement agencies. And so by this, we mean when a crime does occur and when an instance of MMIW takes place, it's not always reported to police, and when it is, proper follow through is not always taken. Those steps aren't being taken to ensure that the victims of these crimes receive justice, or if they're no longer here, that their families get some sense of justice or closure. And because we'll talk about this later, when it comes to statistics, either it's not being reported or it's being reported and it's not being put in the Department of Justice database, we don't fully know how big this crisis is. The numbers we do have, which we'll talk about in a moment, are staggering. They're incredibly high, but those are just what's reported and just what's been documented. So the actual numbers are much higher than we could ever fully conceptualize. And so we can't even see the full scope of this epidemic and how it's affecting our people. And so that, again, is something that prevents victims and their families from receiving justice. Some of the common symbols that you'll often see when referring to this crisis are the red handprint over the face, which you can see on the left image there, and the red dress on the right. If you ever see any of these symbols out in the world, or if you see them on posters and flyers, now you have the contextual background, or you will at least after this presentation, to understand that they are tied to this larger issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit peoples. It's commonly put on t-shirts, masks, earrings, different things of that nature. And you'll also sometimes see the hashtag No More Stolen Sisters being used, as well as other variations like No More Stolen Relatives, things of that nature. So just, be aware of them. And now if you see them out in the world, you'll have hopefully the context to understand what exactly is being talked about. So when it comes to understanding this crisis, we kind of have to start at the beginning because this crisis did not occur randomly. It did not happen without context, and it comes from a long history of documented dispossession and violence against Native and Indigenous peoples, especially women, girls, and Two-Spirit peoples. So when we start looking at the beginning of colonization, when the colonizers would come into their communities, they would very deliberately use violence, and particularly sexual violence against women, as a tactic for control and as a tactic to rid us of our Indigenous matriarchs, who in many cases were caregivers not only of just individual families, but of entire communities. In the case of our Two-Spirit peoples, and if you haven't heard that term Two-Spirit before, we don't have time to fully unpack what that means. I also work at the Resource Center for Sexual and Gender Diversity, and I, alongside Esme Quintero Cubian, do about an hour-and-a-half presentation all about what it means to be Two-Spirit and those experiences. But for the purpose of this presentation, you can understand it as an umbrella term encompassing different LGBTQ+ identities within the Indigenous community, and representing third, fourth, fifth, up to seventh placement gender identities that we have within our communities. So understand it as kind of that umbrella of LGBTQ+ specific to our Indigenous communities. And within the case of our Two-Spirit relatives, there is unfortunately a documented history of violence against our Two-Spirit peoples, starting at the beginning of colonization and the mission system. There's reports of Two-Spirit people being fed alive to dogs in front of their entire communities as a way of breaking those tribal bonds. Oftentimes our Two-Spirit people were our spiritual leaders, our healers. They were fire keepers, they're name givers, and very important and central people in our communities. And so in those deliberate acts of violence against our Two-Spirit peoples, it was another way that the colonizers inflicted harm upon us. And all of this historical trauma, the dispossession of land, taking away things like our language, our culture, forbidding us legally to do things like dancing up until like the 1970s, has all resulted in a tremendous amount of historical trauma, which plagues Indigenous communities to this day. And historical trauma is a combination of immense losses and traumatic events that have been perpetrated upon an entire culture through policy and upheld by the judicial system. When it comes to the judicial system, we'll talk about Native folks in the law a little bit later in the presentation today, but just understand that because of this traumatic history of dispossession and violence, historical trauma is unfortunately very present within Indigenous communities, and it can be seen in the normalization of violence against our people. We see it in the extremely high rates of things like PTSD, suicide rates, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, alcoholism, other disorders of that nature, even in the astronomically high levels of heart disease and diabetes that we see in our communities. All of this is tied back to that traumatic history. And it's one of the complicating factors when we're looking at this crisis that makes our people more vulnerable to it. That is not to say that our communities are only characterized by historical trauma. We're also characterized by our resilience and how we have preserved our cultures and our languages in the face of all of this violence from colonizers, because you can believe that we did not just say, oh yeah, take our land, take our culture, we're fine with it. But it is to help understand why our people are oftentimes targeted in these instances of MMIW. Another issue here that I wanted to bring up is the Indian boarding schools. If you're not familiar with these, I say school very in air quotes, they were not schools. They were places where children were taken from their families and sent to basically, as the quote goes, kill the Indian, save the man. Children had their hair cut. They were beaten for speaking their native languages, forced to convert to Catholicism. And it was a way to assimilate them into colonizer populations and to commit cultural genocide in that way. And these operated up until, I believe it was like the 1970s, some say even, as late as the 1990s. So this is like our parents' generation, our grandparents' generation. And it's something that's caused so much historical trauma that continues to live in our communities today. And all of these things are just historical contexts to keep in mind as we move forward into really unpacking what exactly this crisis is. Okay. And again, if you have any questions, put them in the chat. I would be happy to answer those either now or at the end. I usually, I try and refrain from using statistics and numbers because I want us to understand that every single one of these numbers represents a person who on their own was a unique and beautiful individual, but was also someone's daughter, someone's sister, friend, auntie, relative, and just was someone in and of themselves. But the numbers in this case are so incredibly staggering that I think it would be remiss not to share them with you all, because they just, help contextualize. When I say epidemic, when I say crisis, I mean that. I'm not saying that lightly. And for a long time, we didn't really have any statistics about the MMIW crisis. But in 2016, the National Institute of Justice, through the Urban Indian Health Institute, conducted one of the most thorough, probably the most thorough review of different statistics that we have across what is now the United States and Canada that had been seen in ever. And they found that in 2016 alone, 5,712 cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women were reported to law enforcement agencies. Now, of those 5,712 cases, only 106 were ever logged into the Department of Justice database, meaning that the vast majority of these cases were not logged, and therefore they had no intention of moving forward with them from a legal standpoint of trying perpetrators, attempting to, get some sort of justice for families, or even doing any investigative work, like turning it over to a detective or an officer who would then be responsible for attempting to collect evidence and bring someone to trial. So it shows that the vast majority of these cases, the government decided either for some reason, maybe there wasn't enough evidence in their opinion. Well, they didn't even search for evidence yet, but they decided that they weren't going to move forward with them, and they didn't even log them into any Department of Justice database. And of these cases, 95% were never covered in national or international media, which is another reason why so many folks have never heard of this crisis. It is not something that is heavily reported on, and it often flies under the radar as invisible unless you're someone who it's personally affected your life or your community. In some areas, they found that homicide was the third leading cause of death for Native women ages 10 to 24. As college students, I'm sure a lot of us fall into that age range. So the people that are in my community who I have my classes with, other Native folks, other Native women, knowing that that is the third leading cause of death for folks like myself and for folks in my community is heartbreaking and terrifying. And it's estimated that around 84% of Native women will experience violence at some point in their lifetime, which is much higher than the national average and also equally jarring. And then lastly, in some counties, they found that Native women are 10 times more likely to be murdered than the national average. That one just always done 10 times more likely. And so I think it's really important moving forward to understand these numbers as much as we can. I know they're hard to wrap your head around, and to know that this issue is an epidemic and it's not even comprehensive of all of the cases. The same individuals who took this report also said that if you were to go back to looking at since the 1900s, they're probably missing around 25,000 to 100,000 cases, such a big range that because we didn't have folks collecting data on this, we don't really know how massive this issue is. It's also found that around 83% of the perpetrators of MMIW cases are non-Native men. And so this is not something happening, it is sometimes, most of the time, it's not folks within our communities who are committing these violence, it's coming from outside sources. So heavy statistics, but important to understand as we move forward. When it comes to statistics as well, there are some issues that complicates, getting accurate statistics and fully conceptualizing how big this crisis is. One that I want to share is racial misclassification. So for Indigenous folks who are maybe mixed, whatever you are mixed with, it's more difficult to be recognized on paper as an Indigenous person or someone who is Native American if you are also have other things that you put. So for me as a mixed person, I would not be 100% confident that if a missing poster was to go out about me or information was to be collected about me, that it would properly categorize me as being an MMIW case. This also happens with folks who are Afro-Indigenous or mixed Black and Native. Oftentimes because of anti-Blackness and because of colonial borders and colonialism, they are not counted also as American Indian or Indigenous. And so racial misclassification is something that prevents us from fully seeing the scope of this issue and ties back to a larger conversation about how the government has so much control over classifying who is and who is not considered Indigenous, when that is really something that should lie within our communities, and be something that we have agency over rather than a colonial government. Another thing is borders. Across what we call Turtle Island, so all the way up from like Canada and above to down to Mexico, Central America, South America. This is an issue occurring to Indigenous peoples across all of these different areas. It has different names depending on places that you go. In Latin America and Central America, you might see referred to as femicide or femicidio. But this is the same issue, violence and murder happening to Indigenous women, girls, and folks who occupy different LGBTQ plus identities. It's not, referred to as two-spirit all over these different areas, but the idea, still stands. So indigeneity is not only erased across these borders, but when data is being collected about this crisis, oftentimes they're focusing on particular areas like only the United States or only Canada or only Mexico, and they aren't fully looking at the issue as an issue that spans across continents. So that's also something to understand. When it comes to our LGBTQ plus and two-spirit relatives, I wish I had more to share when it comes to statistics, but unfortunately, the statistics are just not there. Very few statistics exist about this crisis in general, and even less exist specifically looking at the violence against two-spirit and LGBTQ plus populations. I was able to find one report from the Honors Project where it stated that around 40% of two-spirit people experience some type of childhood sexual or physical abuse, 48% experience sexual assault during their lifetime, and 60% experience being physically attacked, mugged, or robbed. But again, though, we don't have the full numbers. We can't really understand it, but we do know that LGBTQ plus people within this country are disproportionately subjected to violence, assault, abuse. And so we can assume that for our Indigenous LGBTQ plus relatives, that same trend follows through. So that's what we know when it comes to statistics. Again, understand every one of these statistics represents a life, represents a family that's been broken by this awful crisis. But I did think it was important to share because the numbers are staggering. Alrighty. One of the things that makes this issue infinitely more complicated is the fact that that people are, based on their race, whether the perpetrator is Native or the victim is Native, they're subject to a very complex web of jurisdictional issues, as you can see in this chart here. So depending on the race of the victim, and depending on the race of the perpetrator of the crime, as well as how severe the crime is, it is subject to be tried in either federal court, tribal court, or state courts. And so one of the things that this means is because information isn't always readily available when a crime occurs to police, like the instant the crime occurs, they don't always know the race of the victim. They don't always know the race of the perpetrator. That means it's going to take a lot longer time for police to collect evidence and investigate cases related to MMIW. So tribal police is having to communicate with state police, is having to communicate with the federal government, is having to communicate with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, all trying to figure out like this very complex web. And it also means that, let's say, there's some discrepancy over whether or not a crime occurred on tribal lands or whether or not it occurred to a tribal member. Different agencies are kind of pushing back and forth saying like, you handle this. Well, no, you handle this. And as we know, with cases where folks go missing or are murdered, time is of the essence. I think it's something like within the first, 72 hours is when you have the best chance of finding someone who's been reported missing. And when those 72 hours are spent with different law enforcement agencies arguing back and forth whose responsibility it is to carry out the searches and to, collect evidence, that's precious time that you could be wasting trying to find the people who are missing and trying to achieve justice. And when cases are turned over to the federal courts, unfortunately, Native victims are rarely ever, given the justice that we are owed. As we saw in a few slides ago, about 67 percent of MMIW related cases, whether it's murder, assault, kidnapping, the federal government chooses not to press charges or even attempt to pursue the case. So as Native people, you know, this communicates to us that the federal government doesn't care about us. It doesn't care about our issues. They don't try and seek justice for us. And it creates, in a lot of cases, a lack of trust and a barrier between law enforcement and Indigenous peoples. In many of our communities, we already grow up hearing things like, you know, be careful of the police. The police are not an ally. They're not someone that you should trust. And then to have these statistics on top of that is another one of those reasons why when these cases are not always reported, and when they are reported, it just, you know, confirms what a lot of us feel like we already know, that these agencies or institutions don't really care about us. So it's like a what's the point sort of thing. They're not going to try and seek justice for me or for my relatives anyway. So that's another thing to understand. Continuing on this trend of jurisdiction, law enforcement, and Indigenous peoples, as a whole, Supreme Court laws disproportionately trend towards not protecting Native peoples. And I have a few cases that I want to talk about here. I'll also preface this by saying I am not a lawyer. I am not a law expert. I've done as much research as I can here, but don't ask me any complex law questions because I will not be able to answer you most likely. But one of the most common cases you see referred to when having conversations about Indian law is Oliphant v. Suquamish Indian Tribe. This case happened in 1978, and essentially what occurred was there was a non-native individual living on tribal land, and that individual assaulted a tribal police officer. He was being tried in tribal courts, but then he objected to that, saying, well, you can't try me in tribal courts because I am not a member of the tribe. The case ended up going all the way to the Supreme Court, where they ended up siding with the non-native individual, Oliphant, and saying, like, you are right, the tribal courts cannot try you because you are not a member of that tribe, even if it occurred on tribal land. And keep in mind that as tribal nations, we are supposed to be, you know, sovereign nations with the ability to try our own cases, to establish our own forms of government, to decide who is and who is not a citizen of our nations. And yet the United States government was able to step in here and say, actually, we don't think you have the right to do that on your lands. So not only is that a slap in the face, but it meant that if any justice was to be achieved in this case, it was now turned over to the federal government. And surprise, surprise, they decided not to pursue the charges, even though he was found guilty in tribal courts. But as we know, that was turned over. Yes, I believe it is being recorded. Yeah, thanks for the thumbs up, Luther. So this case set a precedent for a lot of future cases and is one of the most important and harmful pieces of law legislation against Native people's sovereignty and our ability to try non-Native people within our courts. So understanding this in terms of the MMIW crisis, if someone who's not a member of a tribal community comes onto tribal land and does something related to MMIW, they murder or assault a Native person, this case sets the precedent that we can't try them in our own courts, which is why we see them going over to, you know, federal governments. And as we know already, the federal governments are not choosing to pursue justice in these cases. In another case that happened in 1990, Duro v. Reyna, a 14-year-old boy was shot and killed on tribal land, a member of that tribe, but the person who he was shot by was, you know, not a tribal member. And citing that case we just talked about, the courts, you know, they decided not to press charges against him, even though there was ample evidence that he had murdered a 14-year-old boy in broad daylight. So when talking about just how harmful that earlier precedent is, that's what I mean. Murderers will get away scot-free with things like that. There are other court cases more recently that have happened. This one about Dollar General v. Mississippi Choctaw Indians. This one also made its way to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court was split. Like there are many who believe that that original precedent in Oliphant v. Suquamish Indian Tribe should be upheld and that Native tribes should not have the ability to prosecute non-Natives in tribal court. And then there were also some who disagreed with that and said that they should. But ultimately in this case, the individual, what happened was an underage tribal member was sexually assaulted by a store manager for Dollar General on tribal land. But because of, again, jurisdictional thickets making its way to the Supreme Court. This is all time, this is all money. No justice was ever achieved. And this was in, 2016. So these things are very recent, and these old precedents continue to affect Native peoples today. On the other side of the case, when Native people are the perpetrators of the crime, United States v. Lara, which happened in 2004, found that Native people actually could be tried in both tribal courts and then federal courts for the exact same crime. And so you might be thinking, okay, double jeopardy, you can't be tried for the same crime twice. Well, because Native nations are, sovereign, at least when it's convenient for the government to say so, they found that in this case, the individual who was arrested for public intoxication was tried and found guilty in tribal courts, and then also tried and found guilty in federal courts. So he had his sentence basically doubled. So when it's convenient, the courts say, no, Native people, you can't try folks in tribal courts. And when it's not convenient for them, they kind of flip-flop and say the opposite. So all goes to show that there's a very complicated history of Native people and the law, and disproportionately, the law is not on our side. It's not protecting us. And when it comes to MMIW cases, this means it's really hard for us to achieve justice, and that there's a lot of discontent and lack of trust between these two agencies. I agree, Jean-Michel. Okay. Another issue that we would be remiss not to talk about when discussing the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis is the hypersexualization of Native women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. So we know now with confidence we can say that Native women are disproportionately more likely to experience violence, namely murder or sexual assault, often at the hands of non-Native men. You'll remember that earlier statistic with about 84% of all Native women experiencing violence at some point in their lifetime. But we also have to examine the way in which society contributes to the hypersexualization of Native women. So hypersexualization occurs when Native women are treated like sexual objects rather than people. And one example that always gets brought up here is every year at Halloween, we see costumes like this. We see polka hottie, sexy squaw, Indian princess, things of that nature. And they are, portraying this image that Indigenous women are sexual objects. It paints this really harmful caricature that is not only inaccurate, but ties into the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis, with our women being seen as sexual objects and fetishes, as something that is exotic, something that, it just ties into that. And it's honestly, it's a slap in the face because, people want to wear these costumes to dress like us, or I guess how they think we dress. I personally have never worn anything like this to any ceremonies or powwows I have ever been to, but they want to dress like this caricature of us. But they don't want to actually live our lives and live our experiences. They don't want to be 10 times more likely to be murdered. They don't want homicide to be the third leading cause of death for people like them. And at the end of the day, they can take this costume off and return to their lives. But as Native people, Native women, Native girls, we can't do that. We walk around every day with that target on our backs and with that knowledge in our mind. And for me, this is something that I think about, on a daily basis. Anytime I'm out alone in Isla Vista or I'm walking and it's late at night, I'm always thinking about the MMIW crisis. I'm thinking about the fact that every single generation of women alive in my family today has experienced some type of violence at the hands of non-Native men. I'm thinking about all the missing flyers back home for women who I know the police probably aren't even searching for. And I'm wondering, am I going to be next? Is my face going to be on one of those missing flyers? Is my mom going to have to go to an MMIW vigil and, talk about what happened to me? And it's terrifying and it's heartbreaking. And it's something that's just, these costumes, they feed into that. And it's frustrating and it's heartbreaking. And it's just ironic in the worst way possible that these costumes are the image that pervades in the media, but they aren't at the same time talking about the disproportionate levels of violence we face because of this over-sexualization. So that is something that I want you to understand as well as we continue to talk about this. MMIW also has to be understood within the context of other issues happening across Indian country and happening to Indigenous peoples on a global level. And specifically, excuse me, there's a connection between environmental justice, namely pipelines, and MMIW. So if any of you have ever heard maybe of the Keystone XL pipeline or other pipelines that run through native land or are proposed to run through native land, that's kind of what we're talking about here. When you build pipelines, you need not only someone to come, build it, but you also need people to maintain it. And so what that leads to is the creation of man camps, which are temporary housing communities that are set up typically for male laborers who are tasked with constructing and maintaining those pipelines. And so more often than not, these pipelines are nearby native communities. Oh, this is my cat. And the man camps are either situated on tribal land or they're situated just outside of tribal nations. And so a number of reports and studies, congressional hearings have all come out within the past few years that actually connect these man camps with the increased rates of sexual violence and sexual trafficking that Native women experience. There are really disturbing reports out there of police going to these man camps and finding Native women and children being held captive and assaulted within these man camps. It's absolutely devastating and disgusting to read. They've been described as hotbeds of violence, and oftentimes because they are temporary man camps, that means that the laborers, when they're finished doing what they're doing, they get to move on to their next site before they can be caught and before they can be brought to justice. And thinking back to those legal and jurisdictional issues we have, if it's already so difficult for tribal police and state police to communicate when an individual is permanently situated on tribal lands or near tribal lands, think of the extra effort it takes for them to track that person as they go to different man camps or as they move around the country. There's very little incentive for them to do that. And that's not to say, that all the people who work in these man camps are bad people, but a lot of them are aware that tribal members, for the most part, cannot be tried in tribal court for serious offenses. And if they know the federal government isn't going to charge them, unfortunately, a lot of these individuals use these Native communities as hunting grounds. Thinking again to the hypersexualization of Native women, those individuals who are depraved and who are wanting to commit acts of violence know that this is a good place to do that because of those legal loopholes, and know that they have access to be able to target Native women in these places. So it all just, creates this, legal issues plus hypersexualization plus environmental justice feeds into this bigger issue of MMIW and explains, why this is so difficult to unwrap and to discuss, and why it's so hard to combat, because you're having to look at all of these different issues that are feeding into it and combat each one of those to, deal with the larger crisis. Another, talking about the way that borders tends to divide us. This issue is very prevalent in Canada as well when we're talking about First Nations communities. One area in particular that I like to bring up when discussing this is the Highway of Tears, which is a 450-mile corridor off of Highway 16 in British Columbia, Canada. This highway has been the location of many murders and disappearances dating back to the 1970s. It's a known hunting ground for serial killers, and unfortunately, a disproportionately high number of the victims who've been found on the Highway of Tears are Indigenous women. And the way that killers would often target women here is by picking them up while they were hitchhiking. And you may be thinking okay, we all know hitchhiking is dangerous. Why on earth would these people hitchhike, especially if they know that they're already at a greater risk of going missing or being murdered? But you have to understand that for some people, they have no other choice. This particular Highway of Tears, it has 23 different First Nations communities that are bordering it, many of which fall below the national poverty lines and are impoverished communities. And so the women in these communities, if you want to get into town to buy food for your family, if you want to go to town to work and to make money to pay your rent, and you don't have access to a car or you don't have money for gas that day, and there's no public transportation along this highway, your only option is to hitchhike. British Columbia as a whole has one of the highest rates of unsolved murders of Indigenous women and girls in Canada. And so poverty and a lack of resources is another one of those, outside contributors that funnels into this larger issue of MMIW and explains why Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit peoples are disproportionately being subject to this violence. I know that this is all really heavy information, and I don't want to leave you with this sense of doom and gloom that nothing is being done about this or that no one is talking about this, because that is not the case. Native people, we have always, known that this is an issue, the violence against our women, girls, and Two-Spirit folks, and we have been calling awareness to this and, shining light on this issue for a long time now. In the past few, I'd say 5 years, is when this issue has really kind of started to become talked about more in the mainstream. And it's also seen a number of different bills and laws and operations within an intergovernmental context that are important to understand and to talk about. So one of the first ones we actually saw that surprised a lot of people was Operation Lady Justice, which happened, in 2019. And this actually happened under the Trump administration, which was surprising to a lot of individuals given his past track record voting on Indigenous issues and stances that he took on those different things. It had some critiques, though. It was largely critiqued as being performative. Deb Haaland, who you see on the right here, who's now our Secretary of the Interior under the Biden administration, looked at this and said, with the amount of funding that you're actually dedicating here, this is chump change. Nothing's going to really happen through this. It's performative. You just want the votes. It also was critiqued of having a lack of consultation with Native nations, which is something we'll talk about when it comes to allyship. The administration in this case was saying, we see this as an issue. We're not Native, but we're going to do what we think is best and not actually consult any tribal communities. That being said, there were other folks on the opposite side of the aisle who said, no, this is a good step forward. At least we're getting some kind of recognition. And so there were mixed reviews, to say the least, on that one. I am not aware of any significant changes that came out of it, but that might be just my lack of knowledge. Another one that more recently was put into effect is the Missing and Murdered Unit, or MMU. Deb Haaland on the right, who is now the Secretary of the Interior and the first ever Native person to ever hold a cabinet member, shout out to that, Native representation, created the Missing and Murdered Unit in an effort to combat a number of different things that we've talked about. So it was to provide leadership and direction for cross-departmental and interagency work involving missing and murdered Indigenous people, American Indians, and Alaska Natives. So thinking about, we were talking about earlier, all these different agencies have to communicate with each other. Communicating across organizations can mean red tape. It's a lot of bureaucracy. It's really difficult. So that is what she was specifically aiming to combat with this particular unit, providing that direction to help these agencies communicate with more ease and efficiency and to communicate quicker. So if someone does go missing, you have a protocol from the get-go. How are we going to handle this? Who is going to take over? So those are two significant acts that have recently, or acts, units, whatever you want to call them, that have been discussed recently, and that I'm excited to see what comes out of the last one in particular, the Missing and Murdered Unit, from Deb Haaland, who I should also mention is a member of the Laguna Pueblo Nation, and so is an Indigenous person, an Indigenous woman, matriarch, and so a lot of us are kind of, waiting with bated breath to see what happens from that unit, and we have high hopes for it. At least I have high hopes for it. There are also some acts in Congress that, again, talking about, the past 3, 4, even 5 years that have been brought to light and shined attention on the MMIW issue. The first one I want to mention is Savannah's Act, which was passed in December of 2018. It was put forth to address the MMIW crisis by reforming law enforcement protocols in order to seek justice for Native women. And it also advocated for improving data collection methods related to the crisis, and specifically making those databases more available to tribal agencies. So let's say someone is attacked or someone does go missing, there's a database that they can look at to see, okay, who in our community who is not a tribal member has maybe done this in the past, or who should we be looking at, just so that they can talk to them quicker and hopefully find these people that go missing. And it was nicknamed after Savannah LaFontaine Graywind, who is a citizen of the Spirit Lakes, who was a citizen of the Spirit Lake Sioux tribe in North Dakota, and who unfortunately was brutally murdered in August of 2017. And so a lot of these bills are named after people and women whose lives were cut short by this crisis and whose families have rallied and come together and demanded change on a governmental level. It also led to the Not Invisible Act, which was passed in September of 2020. Again, you know, invisibility is a main reason why we don't hear about this crisis, why it's not in our media, and hence the name for this one. This was an initiative of Deb Haaland, again, who we discussed with the last slide. It was introduced alongside Savannah's Act, but because of government shutdowns, because of COVID, it wasn't passed until 2020. And it was, again, to increase intergovernmental coordination to identify and combat violent crimes within Indian country and against Native peoples. This last act that I want to mention was introduced around the same time as the other two bills, and this was Hannah's Act, which is a state act that occurred in Montana, and it was named after Hannah Harris of the Northern Cheyenne Indian tribe in Montana, who was 21 years old when she went missing and was later found murdered in July of 2013. This one was passed and signed into law in 2019, so a good number of years after Hannah's passing. But this one is interesting because it provided funding to the Department of Justice, specifically to hire a missing persons specialist to help coordinate searches in a quick and timely manner for missing people, but particularly Native women within the Montana area. So it hired someone specifically for that purpose. I would love it if every state could do that personally. And it's sad that it takes this happening to someone for a new law or bill to be introduced, because this is already something that they should be doing. Yes, just the one person. So again, they're giving us crumbs here, but it's better than 0 people. There's still much more work that could be done. I also want to highlight some really awesome individuals across Indian country who are doing great things and bringing awareness to this issue. Number one is Jordan Marie Brings Three White Horses Daniel. Jordan is a runner and a member of the Sioux tribe, and she first kind of started, you know, being talked about in media when she ran in the Boston Marathon in 2019. And not only did she write MMIW on her legs and put a red handprint across her face, but she also dedicated each of the miles of the marathon to a different woman, either in her community or near her community, who had gone missing or been murdered and been a victim of the MMIW crisis. Every year, she organizes a really wonderful initiative where you can do a 5K, a 10K, I believe a half marathon and a full marathon to raise money for and to raise awareness for this issue. Yesterday morning, I did a 5K through the organization that she's working with, which is Rising Hearts LA. And they raised over $50,000 with that one event. So that was really awesome. She continually does great work and is always educating folks on her platform on Instagram. And if you want to follow her, her @ is native_in_LA, native_in_LA, and she's does phenomenal work. Another one is Corrine Rice Gray Cloud, aka like everyone's auntie, everyone across Indian country. She is another social media individual, citizen of the Rosebud Sioux tribe, and an amazing advocate for Indigenous peoples. Her Instagram has a bunch of lessons not only about MMIW, but about pipelines, environmental justice, Native boarding schools, things not to say that are offensive to Native people, like, oh my God, that's my tribe, or oh, you're my spirit animal, like things like that. She just has so many great informational posts that are all saved in the highlights on her Instagram. So even now, if you wanted to, after this presentation, you could go back and look at those. And she has so much free education and advocacy there, which, you know, Native people don't owe anyone free education and advocacy, but I believe she does have a place where you can like buy her a coffee on her Instagram as well. And just, I think recently she's had a bunch of workshops over Zoom that anyone can sign up for. Some of the topics in the last months have been decolonizing the classroom and language mindfulness, again, avoiding like anti-Indigenous terms in your language. And she's just, you know, so open and personable. She shares her life on social media, her challenges, what it's like to be like living where she's living in a blended family. And she's a wonderful person. And yesterday she actually did an event with the person we were just talking about, Jordan Marie Daniel, and they collaborated on Instagram Live. And it was super cool to watch like two of my personal icons come together and talk about important things. I was like, yeah. Okay, that's all I got to say for her. Another one is Rosalie Fish, a little bit younger, probably closer to some of our ages. Rosalie Fish is from the Cowlitz tribe and was inspired by Jordan Marie Daniel to run in her high school track championships and wear a red handprint on her face to raise awareness for MMIW. She actually lost her aunt to this crisis. And so it was personal for her, as it is for many of us, and also to talk about anti-indigeneity within the running community. She discussed, going to state championships and having slurs written on her like locker that she was given there and on the mirror. And just, her standing up for herself, for MMIW, and gathering media attention for this cause. All right, we are gonna move now into another section of this presentation. If you are feeling very like, oh my gosh, this is overwhelming, this is awful, I don't even know what to do with this information, you are not alone. I oftentimes will talk about this and think about this and feel absolutely hopeless and like garbage, but there are ways that you can be an ally. There are things that we can do that hopefully, will give you tangible action items that you can take to feel a little less hopeless about this crisis. I know that educating folks and being on a platform like this helps me feel like I'm doing my part to raise awareness. Before we do that, I'm gonna take a deep breath because this is a lot. There are ways that you can be an ally though to Indigenous peoples. And if you're wondering like, okay, what do I do with this information? Feel free to write this down, to take a screenshot, whatever it is. The first one that I want to mention is, using your privilege and your platform to speak out the oppression of Native and Indigenous peoples. This can mean checking your family and friends if they say something offensive, or they're like, hey, this Halloween, I'm going to be Pocahontas. You can be like, actually, that's racist. And here's the stats to back it up. You can send them to this recording. I'll yell at them for you. Anyway, so, it can be in that way, checking your family and friends. It can also mean using your social media platform, however. I know a lot of us have Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, whatever it may be. You can follow accounts, and I'll give you a whole list of accounts to follow that talk specifically about the MMIW crisis. Repost the things that they share, especially if it's a missing flyer, because those are timely and we need to circulate those as widely as possible to have the best possible chance of finding these people. Share flyers when events like this are happening on campus, or bring them up to your friends, your coworkers. I don't care if you have 5 followers or 500 followers. If you can reach even one single person about this crisis or about events going on that talk about these things, you're creating a difference. You are making an impact. Another thing in that line is sharing information and encouraging allies to do the same. Talk about what you have learned in this presentation. This information should not stay here. It is meant to be shared. Just because, you may not feel like an expert on this topic after an hour and 15 minutes. I know that I never feel like an expert on it. And I put together this whole dang presentation on it. But that's not an excuse not to talk about these things and not to bring them up in different spaces that you are in. So share the information that you have learned and be cognizant of it in your everyday life. The next one is don't make excuses. Like, those are Native issues. These issues are intersectional and they affect us all. Native women are often the matriarchs and the leaders in our community, not just the Native community, but a lot of different communities that are working towards change. One that I think of in particular is the environmental justice movement. Native women are on the front lines, holding it down, chaining themselves to fences to protect our sacred lands and to protect biodiversity. So when we protect Native women and girls and Two-Spirit peoples, who are often on the front lines as well, we are protecting ourselves, we're protecting the land, we're protecting our more than human relatives as well. So when we work towards a better future for those individuals, we are working towards a better future for everyone, Indigenous or not, human or more than human. Coming up on the end here, ask Native people how you can be an ally. We know our oppression and our struggles best. What I've shared today is by no means, comprehensive, and it doesn't now make you an expert on Native issues or on MMIW, but it is a starting place for you to ask yourself how you can further your allyship to Native people. Start by learning whose land you're currently occupying. Is MMIW an issue that's affecting that community? How can you be an ally there now that you have some knowledge about what MMIW is? Listen to us when we say, hey, this is what we need, here's how you can be an ally. Don't assume and take it upon yourself like, after you watching this presentation being like, I'm gonna go make my own event about MMIW. Like, don't do that if you're not Indigenous. Share the events that are already being organized by Native educators and creators, and the videos that are out there, and all these different resources that have been put together by Native people. That again goes back to sharing Native voices, not silencing them, and not putting your own voice above the voices of the Native activists who are talking about this issue. And if someone who you know, a friend, is trying to talk to you about this and sharing their experience, you know, don't be like, oh yeah, I know exactly what that's like. I listened to a 1-hour presentation. Because you don't, you have some ability to now conceptualize and put into context what they're saying, but still be there to listen, be an ally, always listen, instead of talking over. And then lastly, raise awareness and educate yourselves. That's exactly what all of you are doing right now in the midst of all of the stuff I'm sure you have going on with your work and your school. And I know we are all so Zoom fatigued. You decided to come to this presentation and be here. And I was really scared no one's going to show up. So it means a lot to me that all of you are here listening to this, because it is something that I care so much about and I'm so passionate about. And to see 20 faces on this screen of people who also care about it literally almost has me in tears. So thank you for being here, and I hope that you will continue to attend events like this, because we need as many people as possible to be educated on these issues and to stand in solidarity with us. So don't see this as the end, you know, see it as the beginning. Ask yourself, how am I going to show up for Native people today, tomorrow, every day, not just on a National Day of Awareness for MMIW, not just during Native Education Month in November or on Indigenous Peoples Day, but every single day that you occupy stolen land, which is every day. Ask yourself, how are you going to be an ally? How are you going to implement these principles into your everyday life? Period. Done. Okay. Alrighty, and then lastly, if you are someone who needs like more tangible things than that and you want to learn more about this, there are a bunch of different resources I have for you here. There's 2 books that I think are really awesome: Forever Loved, Exposing the Hidden Crisis of Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls in Canada, and Obstruction of Justice, The Search for Truth on Canada's Highway of Tears. So both of these are about First Nations communities, but again, this is information that continues on into what is now the United States and Mexico, Central America, Latin America. And so definitely continue to educate yourself on that, using reading materials, movies. I know some of us aren't readers and we need a movie or a documentary. There's plenty of those. Finding Dawn is one that the MCC just showed last night and is amazing. Somebody's Daughter is another one. Accounts that you can follow: MMI Who Is Missing. It's constantly posting information about this, and Indian Collective is not only talking about the MMIW crisis, but environmental justice, land back, everything related to Indigenous issues. And then there's also some places that you can donate to at the bottom. I know that a lot of us are students and we don't have disposable income, and maybe we don't have money to donate. But if you do have money that you can, it would be great to redistribute that to the organizations that are doing this really important and crucial work. There's also some websites that you can follow. If you're on Facebook, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women USA Facebook page is constantly posting information, missing flyers and things of that nature that they need people to be sharing. There's also websites where you can go to learn more as well, if you'd prefer to use that. These are just some additional resources that you can keep in mind. And that's it. That's the presentation. Thank you so much for being here, for listening. We have about, 10, 15 minutes if we want to, make this an hour and 15. We have as much time as y'all would like. Actually, that's not true. I have a class at 6. We have some time. If y'all have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or to put your question in the chat, and I would be happy to answer them as best as I can.
And I'll go ahead and stop sharing and put it to gallery view just so we can see each other.
Awesome. My throat's so dry.
Any questions, comments, anything? Feel free. There's one. What do you know about MMIW USA? Their website is minimalist. So I've been hesitant. I actually haven't heard of the group.
I think that might be the one that I was mentioning. I'm familiar with their Facebook page, MMIW. I'm familiar with their Instagram and with their Facebook page, not their website. but I know that they have a pretty big following on their social media and that they are just posting relevant information, missing flyers. They'll also post when someone has been found, and that's always like a little uplift to my heart because so many of these people are not found. And so if you use either of those platforms, just a great thing to follow so that you can share information in a timely manner when they post it. Thanks for your question, Julie. Any other questions before we call it a night?
Thank you. Thank you.
Also, I'll go ahead and stop